Zelenskyy really highlights the shortcomings of the UN when you have one of the Security Council at odds with the other and engaged in an illegal war.
Absolutely. Zelenskyy points to the powerlessness of the UN as an organisation, the Security Council in particular, to actually bring this conflict to an end. He disputes that the right of Russia to inherit the Soviet Union's seat on the United Nations, and he's called for reform of the body as a whole. He suggests that the two-thirds majority of the General Assembly should be able to overturn vetoes wielded by the Security Council members. So he's expressing his frustration and actually also tapping into a wider criticism of the international body that hasn't really been reformed significantly since it was created in 1945.
Yes, and its shortcomings sort of rear their heads on many occasions. Is there any momentum, is there any will to look at these issues and try and change and reform the Security Council or the United Nations more broadly?
Yes, and I think actually this special session of the United Nations this September, which was characterised by the absence of the heads of government of 4 of the Security Council members, actually gave impetus to members of the community to actually voice those concerns. So we had Lula da Silva from Brazil calling for reform. There is a general desire to actually see the composition of the Security Council, particularly the 5 permanent members, expanded. And even America indicated that its support for some reform. There's a suggestion that perhaps Japan and Germany and South Africa and Brazil should be added to the list of veto-wielding powers as a way of making it more representative of every continent and of the South more broadly and the world's population. That, of course, would be controversial and difficult to do because China and Russia could veto that in itself and therefore make reform difficult.
Yeah, and that's the issue, that it's stuck with a model that is hard to reform. Is there a better model? Is there one that would require the majority or a sort of a 75% majority of all the Security Council, an expanded Security Council?
It's a good question, but the problem is, and the reason why we have this two-structured aspect of the UN, where you have the Security Council and the General Assembly, is recognising that the great powers, historically, have a special status. And actually, if they are outvoted, what can happen is that they can just leave the organisation, as Hitler's Germany did leave the League of Nations in the 1930s. So the whole idea of the veto power is to, in a sense, protect the rights and the participation of those great powers, and rather than have them leave and make the body impotent, as the League became in the 1930s. So it's a tension, it's a problem, but it's one that's structural and difficult to get around.
Yeah. You know, as Zelenskyy is making his appeal and pointing out the inadequacies, Russia carried out its biggest bombardment of Ukrainian cities in many weeks. It's almost in defiance of the opposition that they are facing at the United Nations.
Absolutely. So Russia's on the back foot. Even Lavrov had to take a really circuitous route to get to New York. He had to fly around European airspace to avoid being arrested if he actually entered European airspace. So Russia's on the back foot diplomatically. So they're trying to actually give a symbolic show of force by attacking 5 major centres in Ukraine, including Lviv. There's actually been spared attacks in most of the last 6 months or so. And of course, as part of that, they're also attacking power stations to give a hint of the strategy they'll adopt in the coming winter to try and freeze the Ukrainians into surrender. So this is them posturing, it's them using gratuitous violence, attacking civilian targets as a way to actually try and show that they're not intimidated by the anti-Russian diplomacy at the United Nations.
Yeah. And then, of course, Ukraine has said that if Russia continues to attack their infrastructure, the sort of necessities that they need to live, that they are in their full rights to do the same to Russia.
Absolutely. And we see hints that actually Ukrainian special forces have been active against the Wagner group in Africa, trying to widen the war and to inflict pain on Russia and the way in which Russia is inflicting pain on Ukraine. But the whole range of drone attacks and the attacks against the bridge to Crimea indicates that despite the fact that Ukraine hasn't broken through the defensive lines, it is able to actually use military force in a punishing way against Russia and targets of value to Russia.
Yeah. It's also quite sort of hard to watch that Poland, who has been such a staunch supporter of Ukraine throughout this war, is now locked in a battle with Ukraine over grain exports. It's sort of something Ukraine doesn't need right at the moment.
And it just shows the way in which this war affects everybody, that the inability of Ukraine to export through the Black Sea because of the Russian embargo has meant that it's trying to find an alternative route to market for its grain. Trying to sell those in Poland, Slovakia and Hungary has had an impact on the price that those farmers there can get for their green crops. So there has been a ban on the sale of Ukrainian grain in those areas. The EU has lifted that ban, but Poland has carried on that ban, and Ukraine is frustrated at that and decided to take them to the World Trade Organization, and that has caused a spat between Poland and Ukraine at a time when Poland's in the middle of an election campaign. There's elections next month, and partly the response that Poland has is to do with domestic politics. The Law and Justice Party wants to vote with farmers, and therefore they're taking a tough stance. I imagine once the election's over, we'll see that tough stance dropped, but just now things are difficult in this area, and Ukraine could do without that, given everything else it has to contend with.